So you could potentially be deploying a search and rescue force from orbit to any spot on the planet in minutes. And that can make a difference. And potentially faster if you don't send humans.
Right.
Robots can handle way more acceleration and are, of course, expendable. So you might be dropping some kind of beacon to someone's location, rescue service in 60 seconds or less, no matter where you are.
We're back with another episode of the Cold Star Project, and we're now focusing on smallsats and space. And my guest today is Isaac Arthur. Hey, so awesome to see you again. You bet. Had you on 6-7 months ago, something like that. It was a great episode, I think, about launching space infrastructure and getting things started. And since focused on small sats, and I wanted you back on first of all because we agreed to do it, and I want you on every time you want to be on, but we don't want to be too frequent. And for those who don't know, Isaac here runs the YouTube channel Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur, which is a great name for it because you are the host, and it is the best science explanation and kind of conceptual exploration channel on YouTube around. I love it, and this morning I was watching the futuristic search and rescue video. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, I picked up a few things from there that I hadn't really thought about, which is why I encourage everyone I run into who's interested in space or futurism to run over there and check that out. So Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur, and I'll definitely mention it again before the end of the show. So what I was hoping we could talk about today is a little bit around small sats, and I know you're not a small sat expert. However, what I want to appeal to is your generosity in the futurism side of things, and maybe you could talk to us from that perspective about these questions. So let's dig right into it. We're entering into an era. Elon Musk could not have helped me out more by proposing, something like 42,000 satellites being kicked into orbit over the next few years and that. So with that kind of manufacturing, and these satellites are only going to last 3, 4, 5 years, burn up, and then need to be replaced with new versions, which is kind of cool. And I imagine there's going to be the operations management guy in me imagines there's going to be economies of scale and good manufacturing processes, which we at Cold Star help to provide. What is about to happen with more small sats being put into orbit and that? What kind of problems do you predict that we're going to see?
I suppose the first most obvious one, assuming the market for it develops so we can actually start getting 40, 50,000 satellites up there, is that you're going to, ideally you design these things to deorbit nice and smoothly so they burn up. But that's a lot of clutter to have up in space. Now, there's a huge volume of space, so it's, even 40, 50,000 things aren't very likely to run into each other, even zipping around several times a day around the planet. But at the same time, when one starts to break up, if it's not breaking up properly, if it's not being knocked down, you could end up with quite a lot of clutter there. And that could lead to Kessler syndrome, which is a situation where you have a big cloud of orbiting debris flying around the planet. And what's tricky conceptually about that is that little bits of debris flying around the planet are moving at a couple dozen times the speed of sound. So even a little tiny nail the size of your finger is going to blast through, a battle tank. It's that, much power that's going on in such a thing. And that's going to cause a lot of problems if there is any serious amount of debris there. And it's not that's a very resolvable issue, but I'd say it's more of a quality control thing. The whole idea of cubesats and small sats, microsats, is that you can mass produce these things, and almost anybody can mass produce them, and they're cheap, right? Which means that it becomes a competitive market, which means that people who aren't necessarily doing their quality control as well might start launching stuff up there that breaks down a little better. And that wouldn't be very likely to be causing a civilization wrecking scenario, I suppose, when you think about it. Same as, you can start getting insurance, something like that in space, you start having regulations and fines. And I don't know who you'd actually be having regulate such fines for, putting up bad CubeSats debris, since it's not they'd be over any one individual country unless it was a geostationary orbit. But that would probably be how you would deal with that. You'd have to start fining people for bad construction, so they're not just cutting corners.
Makes sense. So I wanted to get into a little bit about tracking. We've got Leo Labs, and I've had some guests on who we've talked about various ideas that they've got, business ideas for tracking, some with a device, some by seeing. Are there any potential issues that you're aware of with tracking of all these small sats?
They are definitely trackable, but the thing is, the smaller an object is, obviously, the harder it is to pick up, and that's a cross-section thing. When you're trying to pick up something out the space shuttle, and that's naked eye visible, when it's orbiting the planet, same as the space station is. Little CubeSat the size of a coffee cup is a much harder object to track, especially because you have to be making sure you're using a frequency radar that has a smaller wavelength than the actual object does. Otherwise, you get a very blurry hit, and you can't necessarily track its vector too well off of that. Although that's certainly a manageable issue. For one thing, you could start putting up CubeSats that were nothing but radars. But if you have a lot of these going on there, and again, that's that Kessler syndrome issue. If you're not able to track these things too well, because there's just so many of them, you start getting that enhanced probability of something going kaboom. And that could be a bit of an issue, but it's a resolvable one. I don't want to knock the idea too much. It's a great idea doing microsats, but at the same time, it does represent a few new challenges. Okay. And one of those is trying to keep track of all of them.
Right. So we could use a ground-based system, a terrestrial system. We could put something up in orbit, maybe at a higher orbit, to look down and track these things.
Sure, there's a lot of ways to track an object like that. And they're not, it's not that hard to get a hit on something that's only a few hundred kilometers off the ground. It's just one of those situations where most of our existing radar isn't really designed with that in mind. Quite to the contrary, we usually try to make sure the radar does not pick up objects the size of a board. So, so it has come with its own new infrastructure for something like that, but not a prohibitive one per se. And again, there's the other issues. These things don't last as long. So you got more of these objects, they decay faster, or they're being launched cheaply. It's not like they're going to come with big bases and support themselves either. So like right now, you can rely on NASA or ESA or some of the other ones to actually keep track of their stuff. You got a small company that's a startup launching CubeSats, goes out of business.
Yeah, who's watching their stuff, right? And yeah, I got into a conversation with some folks in the space insurance industry this week and last week about it, and because somebody had written an article, a pretty good article. It had some mediocre kind of principles, or constants that they were thinking of, like $1 million per satellite is not a real cost. That's going to be bearable. But it did raise the question, and I got the impression that a lot of these folks had, including me, had not thought about the tracking problem and the economics and that. And of course, the business guy in me says, well, the end customer is going to pay for tracking. Sooner or later, that's who always pays, right? And so do you build that into the subscription, and a slice of that comes off and pays Leo Labs or something to keep these things, on record?
It's a little bit like aircraft control. Now, mind you, I don't know off the top of my head how aircraft control is actually funded. I assume the actual air industry pays a big chunk of that, but I'm assuming there's also a fair amount that's, I don't want to say government subsidy, but handled by the government. And you might get a case where NASA was tracking all this stuff anyway, or a space defense thing, or whichever country, and they might have a cost they attached to it that was cheaper than trying to do it on your own. But and they might do that just to make sure these things stay tracking. Because again, if you're doing this on a margin, you got slim margins, you start going out of business, you start cutting down on your tracking first, because your ability to track your satellite if it's damaged is not as important to you in terms of making sure the business keeps running, unless there's very punitive fines associated with blowing a hole in the side of somebody else's equipment.
Right. Well,
so
I guess
that would get kind of cut corner on something like that too.
Right. So maybe that's a place where insurance could go into, as well as creating a bag of money at the end of life of the whole thing to clean up. So what other debris cleanup problems do you see, and maybe some solutions? I mean, do we have to get some sort of vehicle into orbit to gobble up all this trash, or what?
Not necessarily. There are a number of ways you could do that, including the use of nuclear weapons. But probably the best one we've got on the table right now, especially if we start developing more resistant solar panels that can operate well in space, although it can be a ground-based system too, would be to have a laser broom, as it's called. And a laser broom, it sweeps the area clean, but people might think you'll vaporize the objects. That's not what you're doing. Using the laser to, one, make sure you got a solid hit on where it's actually at, and then two, you ramp up the power and you burn a little bit off the side of it. And of course, you're burning a little bit off the side of an object in space. That's creating thrust. It's a little bit of a rocket flame. So you tap it on the side, and this is why you prefer to have one higher in orbit as opposed to ground-based. You give it a little push so it deorbits that piece of debris. And then you just let the atmosphere do the rest of the work. But that's a laser broom. It's basically an ablative concept. You ablate a little bit of material off it. And that's, when we talk about using a laser to get rid of a comet or asteroid coming towards us, it's the same idea too. You're not death starring the entire thing. You're burning material off the side of it to act as a little bit of a rocket flame, pushing it in a given direction. Okay. And to the course that you would prefer to have. Which is actually an interesting way of kind of tractor beaming something like a comet in, is you could set up something on the other side of it that was absorbing being you shot out way in deep space. Instead of pushing it away, you let it evaporate with that energy, a rocket tail that pushes it towards your destination. But you start sending something out there as a basic package, of course. But that kind of laser boom technology is likely to be the big one that gets used. With the slight problem that you're likely to, I mean, if you're doing it in orbit, I suspect you'd probably have defense trees that insisted that the laser has to be a frequency that blooms really badly in the atmosphere or gets absorbed really heavy in the atmosphere and cannot be above such and such a wattage, in order to prevent people from deciding to ablate a city, for instance.
Right. Or, well, yeah, I mean, you better trust who it is, too, because you don't want them aiming the laser broom at the wrong target.
Now, mind you, in most of these cases, you'd be talking about something designed to basically get something the size of a coffee cup. So it's not like it's going to be, blowing up a city. But, of course, if you got one up there for asteroids, a different story. And if you got thousands of those in operation to deal with like millions of pieces of space junk, then you might have something that people start using as a weapon platform. Now, that's not to say that sort of thing is probably going to happen eventually. If you're going to go up into space, you're eventually going to put weapons up there too. But I think in the short term, that would be one of those other issues that got in the way. And, you got insurance in play, you got business models, you've got legal concerns too. And of course, something any business is going to have to deal with there is legal issues and paying their lawyers, because there's going to likely be an awful lot of problems with that.
Right. And I've got a couple of space lawyers coming on in the next few weeks, so I'll be able to ask them poignant questions about this topic and see how they respond. That should be lots of fun. Let's move into search and rescue and life-saving operations. We're going to have all these constellations in orbit, and they're going to be able to let us see things and have connectivity that we didn't have. And, I watch all sorts of YouTube channels. I'm not a big TV guy, but I enjoy Odyssey type things where some guy takes a sailboat and sails it across the Pacific or something. And these guys, they get out of communication frequently and get stuck, and they've got sail power and that's it. And they're out there for a week or two without any connection to anybody. And then they're real excited because some red helicopter flies over top to check on them in regular radio range and that. So what is going to happen here? Do you think?
I remember an article that somebody had floated at sea for like 2 years, and then part of the time they had somebody else with them before they got rescued. I can't remember the fellow's name, but in the old days, if you were lucky, you might see a ship pass by on the horizon and somehow be able to flag it down. Nowadays, it's a lot harder to get lost if you are in anything that's actually being tracked, which is not necessarily a private, ship, right? But we've still lost planes. Applications of space that are actually useful on Earth, non-scientific ones. One of those is obviously tracking. Military use it for that. We use it for GPS and things like that. And you got a couple different angles you can use on that. One, of course, is your actual personal survival gear. If you've got Wi-Fi satellites over the entire planet, passing overhead, even if it's relatively lower coverage over the poles, you still have things orbiting on those vectors. Then all of a sudden, if you got nice cheap solar panels and durable batteries, you can flag yourself down a signal, and that's a GPS plus rescue beacon right there. And that's on that side of things where you're basically your survival gear. If that is lost or broken, then what a bunch of CubeSats or just mini surveillance satellites offer us is the ability to start tracking people. Now, that, of course, is one of those examples of technology that maybe we really don't want in place too much because, we don't really lose that many people. And if you got the coverage for that, what are those satellites doing in the meantime? Who are they looking at? Is it your backyard? But there are certain limitations on how much something like that would seem to be worth. You think about a camera. The thing is, and I imagine some folks have heard of what's called the Finder project. I can't remember what the actual acronym Finder means, but it was a combination that was done by NASA and DARPA to use microwaves as the ground penetrating radar as a way of basically doing a life science detector. And think about those very tiny frequencies of microwaves. They penetrate through rock really well. And we're talking about something that's no stronger than a Wi-Fi signal to such an area of several hundred feet, right? You have little tiny changes in your body when your heart beats or when your lungs move, and that picks up on a radar signal as a very specific signal. So we can hunt for people and find them under 30, 40 meters of collapsed debris. Now, that has to do with how much debris is in the way, and you can ramp that signal up. But when I say ramp that signal up, it's not just so it can penetrate the ground better, it's so that you can do it from way further away. You can focus the beam in pretty good, but you can also just increase the power level. So you could have microwave satellites that were able to have no problem not just seeing somebody on a ship that was floating around, but actually being able to spot somebody buried underneath debris or buried in, in the middle of a forest, things like that would not be optically visible. And that would potentially be a very powerful search and rescue technology. And I guess the other one, it's a little bit more high tech, a little bit more futuristic, is we actually start dispatching rescue services from space. Because while you would almost always think you'd have some place, probably maybe Antarctica, where you had a rescue station a lot closer than a couple hundred kilometers up in space you can just fall right down. And more importantly, you can accelerate down too if you want and brake towards the end. So you could potentially be deploying a search and rescue force from orbit to any spot on the planet in minutes. And that can make a difference. And potentially faster if you don't send humans. Robots can handle way more acceleration and are, of course, expendable. So you might be dropping some kind of beacon to someone's location, rescue service in 60 seconds or less, no matter where you are. And that's the sort of thing that would be insanely expensive to contemplate right now, and would be pretty expensive, I think, even if you had a much more developed infrastructure in space. But, the amount of stuff we do for emergency services these days compared to what it was when I was a kid, let alone a century and a half ago, is a lot different. If the society is prosperous enough, they got no problem blowing $1 billion to go rescue a few folks. And we'll see how that develops, but that's century off or more.
Right. Well, the idea today of being able to detect life signs underneath a collapsed building or in a coal mine or something is really, that happens. Yeah, it happens. And also I really like the idea from the connectivity of not just, they can see where we are, but they can also send us, if not a robot, some information, right? Like communicate, hey, I've got this problem. Okay, here's how you solve it. Even sending a video or something, right? Which is
and that's that increase in portable technology kind of aspect of things. You say, what changes to emergency stuff? And of course, the most important aspect of any sort of emergency or crisis is that will to survive, followed by the knowledge and then the equipment, right? But if you got enough equipment, it helps to handle most of those other crises. Whereas we get better with things like that when everyone's got a smartphone or a little implant in the ear they talk on or whatever it is. No one's ever out of communication. And even if they do somehow hit a dead zone, they are being tracked in some fashion, if it's nice and private and they're on their own personal thing. And someone's going to have the equivalent of a dead man switch. My signal's been off for a minute, send an emergency note to the police. And just the sheer amount of data you have on that, not only do you know where they were when they left, but everybody who went in or out of that spot too. You could probably subpoena that if you needed to, even with privacy rules in place. And now there's 100 people who went in that area. Where are they at? And that is insanely useful for solving crimes, emergencies, and many other things. So, although again, a bit of a privacy
the big brother side of things, starts to get a little scary.
No,
okay.
So I think in a case like that, one would guess you'd probably have exactly that as a subpoena kind of situation, where if it was mandatorily provided, you had to, quickly call up a judge and say, hey, we need to, pull everyone's ID from this, 300-foot radius. That's not the nicest idea either, but that's, I think, a lot more tolerable in terms of cost for security than just the ability to say, oh, flip on the cameras, who's there?
Right. Yeah, it can't be open season.
Yeah, and of course the other thing is, while the satellites will not see through your ceiling, the microwave ones would. So,
interesting. So I'm having a few guests on who are interested in launch vehicles and making these launch vehicles smaller, cheaper, and their capacity will be lower. Obviously, they'll be able to send up 8 or a dozen small sats instead of 100. As a ride share with a larger payload. What do you see, just with your futurist hat on again, over the next 2 or 3 decades in industry developing for continuous launches? What's that going to look like with spaceports maybe and vehicles?
If we're talking about unmanned, one problem with a spaceport is that it usually cannot be near any city if it's actually using rocket launches. The speeds involved cause those supersonic blasts, not to mention anyone's been near Cape Canaveral. That's a very loud thing, and even a small little rocket's still pretty loud. We do have some options around that, though, and obviously you can have dedicated spaceports that are on the coast far from anybody else, although coasts are valuable property. So that might be where you say, I would like to set up a launch site on a floating, ship, and that might get you a lot of the. I can't remember what the group's called, but there's always interest in micronations that are set up at sea seasteading. I think we did an episode on that. I lose track of our episodes these days. But the other option is if you're doing unmanned pods, many of those would be materials that could handle a much higher acceleration rate than a human could. Some would not be, though. But for the ones that were, you might be able to do a bulk transport for using a mass driver or rail gun. And you have some kilometer-long gun that accelerates stuff at 30, 40 Gs up to orbital velocity and just through them. And that might let you do some very bulk launches, because that sort of thing is very cheap. There's a big capital cost in putting something like that up. But if you're using it nonstop, it's the same concept as a freight train. And of course, we have more far-ranging things like orbital rings that might take that position even more thoroughly. But you don't build a transit line to the Oregon until after you've already colonized it. First, you got to go the Pioneer route. Same for freeways. You don't put those in there. There are a lot of ways to bring launch costs down a lot, and we were starting to have to look at some of those until SpaceX actually came by with the usable rockets and really made that a lot cheaper launch costs. We're still to start looking at some of those things, because in the end, there's a limit to what you can do with chemistry. But for right now, the reusable rocket has made it a lot easier to put off some of those projects, which has a downside. Sometimes a very good technology makes other things that were viable not viable for research anymore. But we'll get back to those, I think, at some point. In terms of spaceports, though, it's so hard to say. I think for a lot of those, you probably would see the island-based ones being used a lot, or those countries that had a reasonably close location to the equator and also happen to have eastern coast real estate that they weren't really using, because no one's going to let you launch, commercial rockets over populated areas.
Right.
They're not going to be too thrilled about doing that, even for like nationally covered ones. But say, I like business, but I don't think I trust them to be accountable for launching a very powerful rocket over the place where I lived.
Very, very true. What do you think about jobs, people moving into jobs centered around space, either manufacturing or piloting or even tourism? Is that going to be a thing in our lifetime, or are we going to have to wait for that?
To some degree, it already is. Aerospace is already a pretty big industry, even just limited to the space component. I don't know what the satellite business runs, but it's got to be in the billions a year. And that's only going to go up. As to which ones are an option, if you start getting the point that you have space hotels, relatively cheap launch costs in space hotels, and we could do that. That is potentially the point where you get to the way you can launch for, say, $100 a kilogram, which is on the extreme end of what you could do with a rocket, really. You would potentially cheaper fuels and really good reusability. At $100 a kilogram, that means a person can go up with their cargo, their personal launch bag for $10,000. At that point in time, that becomes a massive tourist industry. But even at $1,000 a kilogram, there are a lot of folks who could afford $100,000 for a trip to space. And if you're doing that, you might want your own personalized spacesuit, right? And that becomes quite the designer thing. After all, one is going up there to take photos. You'd have, I would say, it could be a bit of a thing for the fashion industry, but that would be a long time coming as any more than a niche application. Although when you think about it, a lot of the fashion industry already is niche applications. In terms of jobs, so I'd say the big one for people who are actually working in space would probably be telepresence early on. in any kind of space station, you'd have presumably people who were on site, but it's so much easier to have a robot that is specified to that task, that is expendable, that is probably lighter than a human, and that can be operated 24 hours a day by 3 different operators as they go into their own shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And while you're close to the moon or closer in orbit, you really have no signal time. It's in that case, the biggest problem is that you have to bounce the signal around the planet if there's somebody in the way, if it's on the wrong side of the planet every 90 minutes or whatever. But that's hardly a big time signal lag. So telepresence operators, but that's a market that's already probably going to be expanding with us anyway. I think telepresence, it's nice to be able to automate simple tasks, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of things where telepresence is what's going on. You automate somebody to mow your lawn, you use a robot for that, but when it comes to many of the other gardening things, it might be cheaper to have a person telepresently operating the weeding machine or whatever it is. Same applies for space. And I think in terms of which actual big businesses there would be that were actually people in space, not on the engineering side or the research side or the actual launch facility side, although you certainly have a lot of personnel for that and probably a lot more on the ground than actually up in space. It's really hard to say. I think you have probably a lot of folks who basically jack of all trades, because in a lot of these things, what you're going to need is a few people that are on site and who are very good at taking instructions, which means they know just enough about it to be competent, and be able to hear somebody say, turn the screwdriver, no, the other screwdriver on that bolt right there, 10 times without getting nervous or freaked out by the fact that it's venting air, or apply pressure to that wound right there. So that would be a pretty big example. They would probably be folks like that. For like folks who didn't have a major skill set, that's probably the easiest round to space, would be that jack of all trades kind of person who is really good at following instructions and staying calm.
Right. Yes, staying calm. It's funny how emotional this stuff is still, even with all the engineering. So some terrestrial-based person can be the subject matter expert, and they can direct.
That is kind of what our astronauts are. Yeah. I mean, now a lot of them have doctorates, of course, too, but that's because we can afford to have the absolute cream of the crop. But for the most part, your astronaut's main job is to be able to stay calm and know enough to be able to take instructions.
I remember the Soviets went a different route in that they didn't educate their people up quite the same way, at least early on. Well, let's finish up here. I can imagine smallsats, which I love and we're focused on at the moment, going up, becoming a technology, and much the same way that, like, when the telephone came out, it was originally wired technology and then moved to cellular towers, right, and a network. I can imagine smallsats being replaced by some technology in the future, and I'm wondering if you have any ideas about that.
Smallsats being replaced by other technology?
Yeah, a different kind of technology.
To a degree, I'd say probably, yeah. The big advantage of the small sat, and I wouldn't replace it entirely more than television replaced radio. There's niche applications. Right. The big advantage, the attractive advantage to the microsat these days is that it's a really cheap way to get your experiments set up on your timeline and to your specifications. If you've got multiple space stations up there that basically serve as storage sites for these things where they can provide a little bit of tending. Again, something for that jack of all trades. He can tend 20 different experiments or the private, whatever it is that's up there. That starts reducing the desire to have the CubeSat of your own, and it's more just a package that's being delivered and taken care of. And again, the problem with the CubeSat is that it is very short duration lifespan, right? And in many cases on a space station like that, you might instead just be renting project space, whether you need it for 3 months, a year, or whatever it is, it's that amount of time, 10 years, right? But the CubeSats are very vulnerable. They are vulnerable to damage. They're not secure. They have to have some way of transmitting, They have the same problem you have with anything that's micro-sized and designed to operate independently. You've got limited options. You have to include a power source on it. You have to provide some guidance, communication. How much easier is if you can scrap all that and not have to pay the launch cost on that because it's on a facility that's someone going to take care of that. So there will always going to be a demand for some amount of microsats, especially when you start I want to go check out a bunch of asteroids, see which ones have gold on them. I send the smallest asteroid, smallest little camera I can that's cheap, But at the same time, for a lot of other projects, you want that tended. You don't want to have to do redundancy of all the little components that have nothing to do with what you're doing. You want something where you can actually point a finger at someone and say, you owe us money for having messed up this failure or fault on your end. And, it's probably going to be, in many cases, a lot easier to get funding for a project you're sending up to one of those existing space stations than to just a CubeSat for it.
Okay, so sooner or later, this stuff is going to be like delivering a package to somebody's house or an office building or something like that, or a factory that contains a lot of this stuff.
And of course, it'll be phases on exactly, how commercialized is space at that point, how privatized is it, what sort of rules are going on. But there will be, in most cases, more advantages to having a facility that's being tended and upkept than at just floating around in space on its own, where it can get damaged, sabotaged, or go into pieces and damage other people's stuff and get sued.
Right. Okay, well, I really appreciate you coming back on, and look forward to maybe talking to you again in the spring. My guest today has been Isaac Arthur. Isaac, why don't you tell the folks where they can run into you and hear your wonderful voice more?
Well, you can find me on iTunes, SoundCloud, my website, isaacarthur.net, or, of course, every Thursday morning on YouTube at Isaac Arthur, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur.
That's right. And I also follow you on Twitter. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Jason.